In 1556, a French peasant was arrested for eating bread made from chestnuts. His crime? Consuming food that only nobles were allowed to touch. The punishment? 3 months in prison. Today, you can walk into any supermarket and buy whatever you want. No one checks your status. No one questions your choices, but for most of human history, food was regulated, controlled, banned. Kings decided what you could eat. Churches declared certain foods sinful. Governments outlawed ingredients we now consider harmless. Some of these bans were about power. Others were about religion. A few were about keeping secrets. And here is what makes this story strange. Many of these forbidden foods were not just delicious. They were nutritious, medicinal, essential to human health. Yet they vanished. Not because they tasted bad, not because people stopped wanting them, but because someone in power decided you should not have them. So what were these foods? Why were they banned? And what happened when they disappeared from our plates? The answers reveal something disturbing about how we eat today. Because every time a food was forbidden, we lost more than just flavor. We lost knowledge. We lost biodiversity. We lost connection to the land. This is the story of foods that kings feared, and why modern science is begging us to bring them back. Food control is older than written law. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs reserved certain fish for royal consumption. In medieval Europe, sumptuary laws dictated who could eat which meats based on social class. In 18th century England, game laws made it illegal for commoners to hunt deer or wild birds on their own land. But the real story begins in the 1500s. This was the age of empires. Nations were competing for global dominance, and food became a weapon. European monarchs realized something crucial. If you control what people eat, you control the people. So they started banning foods that gave commoners independence, foods that grew wild, foods that did not require purchasing from landowners, foods that made people healthy enough to question authority. There is a story from 1748 about a Scottish farmer named Malcolm MacLeod. He was caught harvesting seaweed from a beach near his village. The local lord claimed ownership of all coastal resources. Malcolm argued that seaweed had fed his family for generations. It grew wild. It belonged to no one. The lord disagreed. Malcolm was fined 6 months' wages. His family nearly starved that winter. But here is the strange part, that seaweed was rich in iodine, iron, and trace minerals his family desperately needed. Without it, his children developed goiters and weakened bones. The ban did not just take away food, it took away health. And Malcolm's story was not unique. Across Europe, North America, and Asia, similar laws were emerging. Indigenous foods were being declared primitive. Wild foods were called unsanitary. Traditional preparation methods were labeled dangerous. But the real reason? Control. Governments wanted people dependent on agriculture they could tax. On markets, they could regulate. On food systems, they could monitor. So they banned the alternatives. What happened next changed human nutrition forever. Because when you forbid certain foods, people forget how to find them, how to prepare them, how to recognize their value. Within a generation, that knowledge vanishes. And once it's gone, it's almost impossible to recover. So what exactly were these foods? The ones that kings banned, but bodies craved. Let's start with number 1. Acorns. This was the grain of the forest. For thousands of years, acorns fed more people than wheat. They grew on oak trees that required no cultivation, no irrigation, no purchased seed. A single mature oak could produce 500 pounds of acorns in a good year. Indigenous peoples across North America, Europe, and Asia relied on them as a dietary staple. But here is the strange part. In medieval Europe, nobles began claiming ownership of oak forests. They passed laws declaring that acorns belonged exclusively to their livestock, specifically to the pigs they fattened for profit. Peasants caught gathering acorns faced fines, beatings, or imprisonment. Why? Because acorns represented food independence. A family with access to oak groves did not need to buy grain from landowners. They did not need to work manor fields. They could feed themselves from the forest. The ban was about economics, not nutrition. And what we lost was significant. Acorns contain more protein than rice, more healthy fats than wheat, and powerful tannins that modern research links to blood sugar regulation and gut health. Korean and Japanese cultures never stopped eating them and still harvest acorns for traditional dishes today. But in the West, we forgot they were even food. At number 2 is hemp seeds. This was the original superfood. For centuries, hemp seeds were considered one of the most nutritious foods available. They contain all 9 essential amino acids, a perfect ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids, and more protein per ounce than beef. George Washington grew hemp. So did Thomas Jefferson. Not for fiber, for food. But in the 1930s, hemp became a target. When the U.S. government launched its war on marijuana, it conflated the entire cannabis plant into one category. Hemp seeds, which contain virtually no THC, were banned alongside their psychoactive cousin. The result? An entire generation grew up believing hemp was a drug, not food. Here is what makes this ban particularly tragic. Hemp grows in poor soil, requires minimal water, and needs no pesticides. It is one of the most sustainable crops on Earth. Farmers could grow it almost anywhere, which meant they did not need to buy expensive seeds or chemicals from agricultural corporations. The ban protected industrial interests, not public health. Today, hemp seeds are legal again. In many countries, nutritionists call them a complete protein source. Athletes use them for recovery. But most people still do not know they can eat them, because for 70 years, we were told they were forbidden. That is how you erase food from cultural memory. Number 3 is nettles. This was the vegetable that grew everywhere. Stinging nettles thrived in hedgerows, forest edges, and abandoned fields. They required no planting, no care, no cost. For rural families, nettles provided free greens from early spring through autumn. They were boiled into soups, brewed into teas, and cooked like spinach. But as land enclosure laws swept through Europe, nettles became a problem for landowners. Because nettles indicated commons land, places where people had traditional rights to forage. When nobles fenced off these areas for private use, they needed a reason to keep people out. So nettles were declared weeds, dangerous plants, unsanitary food. Local ordinances made it illegal to harvest them from enclosed land. Slowly, the practice died out. By the Victorian era, eating nettles was considered a sign of desperate poverty. What we lost was one of the most nutrient-dense greens in nature. Nettles contain more iron than spinach, more calcium than milk, and compounds that modern herbalists use to treat allergies, arthritis, and inflammation. They still grow wild across Europe and North America. They are still free. But most people walk past them, without realizing they are looking at food their ancestors cherished. At number 4 is pond snails. This was the protein of wetlands. Freshwater snails were harvested for thousands of years across Asia, Europe, and Africa. They were abundant, easy to gather, and required no land or livestock. French peasants collected them from ponds and streams. Southeast Asian cultures still prepare them in dozens of traditional dishes. But in 19th century Europe, pond snails faced a double ban. First, the rise of industrial agriculture meant that wetlands were drained for farmland. Harvesting snails became trespassing. Second, as French cuisine became codified by chefs like Escoffier, only certain snails were deemed acceptable, specifically the larger land snails raised commercially. Wild pond snails were declared crude, unsophisticated, unsafe. The real reason? They could not be commodified. You could not farm them efficiently. You could not control their supply or price. Modern research shows that freshwater snails are rich in protein, omega-3s, and minerals like zinc and selenium. They convert algae and plant matter into nutrients humans can absorb. In areas facing protein scarcity, they represent a free, renewable resource. But in the West, they vanished from our plates because they could not be sold. Number 5 is dandelion greens. This was the original farm-to-table vegetable. Dandelions grow in every climate, every soil type, every lawn and field. Before industrial agriculture, dandelion greens were a prized spring vegetable. Italian, German, and French immigrants brought dandelion recipes to America. They were sold in city markets alongside lettuce and spinach. But then, something changed. In the 1950s, the American lawn became a status symbol. Suburban homeowners were taught that a perfect lawn had no weeds, and dandelions were enemy number 1. Chemical companies developed herbicides specifically to kill them. Neighborhood associations wrote rules banning them. Children were taught that dandelions were ugly, invasive, worthless. Within 20 years, eating dandelion greens became a forgotten practice. Yet dandelions are more nutritious than almost any vegetable you can buy. They contain more vitamin A than carrots, more calcium than broccoli, and compounds that support liver detoxification. Herbalists use them to improve digestion, reduce inflammation, and regulate blood sugar. They are still free. They still grow everywhere, but we poison them, then buy expensive greens at the grocery store that contain fewer nutrients. The ban was cultural, not legal, but the effect was the same. At number 6 is pine bark. This was survival bread. In Northern Europe and North America, indigenous peoples and early settlers used the inner bark of pine trees to make flour. It was harvested in late spring when sap made the bark peel easily. The cambium layer was dried, ground, and mixed with grain to extend food supplies through harsh winters. But as Scandinavian nations modernized, bark bread became a symbol of poverty. Government campaigns promoted wheat flour as civilized, modern, progressive. Bark bread was labeled primitive, something only backwards people ate. The knowledge faded within 2 generations. What we lost was a renewable carbohydrate source that required no farmland. Pine trees grow in areas too cold, too rocky, too steep for agriculture. The inner bark contains starches, sugars, and vitamin C that prevented scurvy during long winters. Today, survival experts recognize bark as an emergency food. Finnish researchers have even revived small-scale production, marketing it as a historical curiosity. But imagine if it had never been banned. Imagine if northern communities still knew how to harvest it sustainably. Food security in cold climates would look entirely different. Number 7 is organ meats. This was the most nutritious part of the animal. When hunters killed deer, elk, or wild boar, they consumed the organs first. Liver, heart, kidneys, and tongue were considered delicacies, packed with vitamins, minerals, and compounds unavailable in muscle meat. But game laws changed everything. In Britain, the Game Act of 1671 made it illegal for commoners to hunt on most land. Only property owners could kill wild animals. Poaching became a crime punishable by transportation or death. In America, similar laws emerged as European settlers claimed indigenous hunting grounds. Wild game became the exclusive privilege of landowners and licensed hunters. Organ meats from these animals vanished from common diets. Simultaneously, industrial meatpacking shifted consumption toward muscle cuts. Organs were considered offal, waste. Cultural attitudes changed. By the mid-20th century, eating organ meats was seen as strange or desperate. Modern nutritional science has reversed this view. Liver contains more vitamin A, iron, and B vitamins than any other food. Heart is rich in CoQ10, which supports cardiovascular health. Kidneys provide selenium and riboflavin. These are the nutrients missing from modern diets. Nutrients that grass-fed, wild-sourced organs once provided freely. But we forgot they were food because we were no longer allowed to hunt them. So what do all of these foods have in common? They were free, they were abundant, and they made people independent. That is why they were banned. Not because they were unsafe, not because they tasted bad, but because they existed outside controlled food systems. They grew without landlords. They required no markets. They represented knowledge passed down through generations rather than sold by corporations. Every ban followed the same pattern. First, access was restricted. Then, the food was culturally stigmatized. Finally, people forgot it existed. And once food knowledge disappears, it rarely comes back on its own. But here is what modern science is discovering. The nutrients in these forbidden foods, the minerals, the proteins, the healing compounds, they are missing from industrial diets. Deficiencies in iron, iodine, omega-3s, and trace minerals are epidemic in developed nations. We are overfed, but undernourished, and the solution might be hidden in foods we were taught to ignore. Some cultures never stopped eating these things. Koreans still harvest acorns. Italians still forage nettles. Scandinavians are rediscovering bark flour. Indigenous communities never forgot the value of organ meats. They were not banned. Everywhere. Only where power structures needed compliant populations. So the question becomes, what else did we lose? Every time you eat, you are making a choice. Most of us choose from what corporations offer, from what grocery stores stock, from what advertisements tell us is normal. But normal is new. For most of human history, people ate what grew around them, what the land provided, what their ancestors taught them to recognize and prepare. Some of that knowledge is gone forever, but some can still be recovered. Every time you walk past a dandelion, every time you see an oak tree, every time you notice nettles growing along a fence line, you are looking at food. Food that sustained your ancestors. Food that contains nutrients your body craves. Food that was banned because someone feared what would happen if you did not need them. History is not just what happened. It is what we remember. And food history is what we choose to eat.